how little really understanding on the part of the listener arises as a result of the listening. You know, it's not to invalidate what we do in the bulk of our exchanges with people, because I think mostly what we exchange is feeling, somatic and emotional material. I learned as a teacher long ago that people don't remember what you tell them, but they never forget the way you make them feel. This is important. You know, one of the things that I put high on the list in this storytelling rubric is the notion of teaching. So much teaching can be done with a good story. So much teaching can be done with a good walk in the garden. And I am always reminded that, you know, that's the reason why we consciously decided to move here. Now it's going on 13 years ago. Because I recognize that you could get more, if yin-yang is your subject, you can get more taught in the garden in one day than you can in a year in the classroom. So much of the classroom experience, the physical design of our buildings, is meant to insulate us from the, we'll call them organic manifestations of yin and yang. Humans are so in love with ourselves that we only really value that portion of our environment which we have shaped. Now there's those people who are like back to nature, the hippies, the Taoists. The original Taoist cult, 5 bushels of rice, was basically a back to the land hippie cult. And they did just what the 60s era back to the landers did. They got together, they lived communally, they sort of downplayed the importance of the larger culture's rules and regulations and created their own. They were totally into free love. That whole scene, there it was, 1,800 years ago in southern China. Who'd have thought? So today we're going to talk about 3 treasures. But before I dive in, I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions after. One feature of these ongoing get-togethers will be an opportunity for you to organize and ask any questions that your encounter with this material provokes. In fact, along those same lines of what I've learned teaching, not only do people not remember what you tell them, but they will remember what they tell you. So if you can cause people to talk, that's an important part of, if as a teacher you want to achieve something, you know. And one wonders sometimes, what are we transferring? To me, it all boils down to the use of tools. no matter what the subject matter is, the common denominator of teaching is you want someone to come away with the ability to do something, to use the tools of whatever trade applies to the topic at hand. I remember at UCLA, there's a quote that's attributed to the first what's the name of the person who's in charge of the University of California? Chancellor. The first chancellor was this guy named Clark Carr. And he said, and it's chiseled in stone at UCLA, education is learning to use the tools that the race has found indispensable. You know, this satisfies the definition of what is Jing, the classics. The classics were composed and transmitted throughout Chinese civilization as a way of transmitting the essential software of living. This is what generation after generation had developed, reviewed, refined, and reissued as what you need to know in order to get by. So much of Chinese culture is driven by this kind of impulse of transmitting things across the generations. The reason for that is ancestor worship. The most important thing in a Chinese house is the ancestral tablets that tell the history of the family, that name the ancestors. They become altars in houses where there's adequate resources to permit it. This is where the worship of the ancestors takes place. This is where offerings are presented. This is where things are burned and sent to the spirit world. It was this firm belief in the potency of the dead ancestors that drove so much of what we see as traditional Chinese culture. Because if ancestors have such an enormous value, then it is always the job of the living to ensure the future line of descendants so that someone is there to maintain the family tablets. If not, all is lost. You know, there's different concepts of what it means to die. There's that kind of dying that goes on in most people's lives throughout their lives, where they're kind of surrendering and giving away bits of themselves and compromising this and losing that. There's the dying of the body, the moment that's sort of legal death, brain death. But then there's a kind of final death, which is the last time anyone will ever think about you. This kind of ultimate vanishment stands in more or less 180-degree opposition to the Chinese ideal that pivots around ancestor worship. You always want there to be descendants who are capable of thinking about the ancestors. Not just thinking about, but acting properly. Paying proper respect. This this has taken lots of different forms over the years. It's a subject all unto itself, just the development of, for lack of a better word, we can call it Chinese religion. Before the arrival of the Buddhists in the first century, there was no establishment of religion in China outside of this family-centric belief in worship of fear of all the things that go in religion on the docket with respect to the gods, all was directed at the ancestors. The Buddhists showed up and they had their own tricks and their own style and their own message and their own food and everything. And the Chinese always love foreigners. The Chinese are the opposite of xenophobic. They are xenophilic. They think it's fantastic when foreigners show up. They don't always like them, but it's a good thing in and of itself when the foreigners arrive. You know, in the Tang Dynasty, in the 7th through 10th century, the Chinese capital was probably the center of the world. It was certainly one of the major nodes of civilization on Earth in those days. What was going on in Europe? You know, people were just coming out of the caves. Well, that's not true. Anyway, it's good to have that view of what are the values of the culture from which this knowledge comes. It's particularly good to understand this in relationship to today's topic, 3 treasures. Our name, 3 Springs, is a rendering of this Chinese phrase. There's actually a few Chinese phrases. San Yuan is one. It means the 3 origins. San Bao is another. It means the 3 treasures. These 3 treasures are Jing, essence, Qi, about which we have spoken now for a couple of weeks, and about which we will always and never end speaking, and Shen, spirit. So we'll try to get a little discussion of each of these 3 so that you're familiar with what does this really mean. Starting with Jing, essence. It's important in talking about Jing always to recognize that there are 2 big categories of essence. There is what is called the postnatal or pre-heaven essence, Xian Tian, Xian before Tian heaven. And there's the postnatal, the after. Generally, we think of the dividing point between pre and post as birth. But I don't think it's quite that simple. I think it has to include that span from conception to birth. And we have to recognize that what happens at conception is the initiation of a whole lot of dynamics and processes which definitely can be observed to organize themselves into, let's call them phases. But it's an ongoing development. It's an ongoing process of, and here maybe we can start to develop an appreciation of the sublime sensitivity required to really understand and grasp the importance of the difference between pre-heaven and post-heaven. The pre-heaven is what you get from your parents. In the blending of the male sperm and the female egg, a process takes place which is qualitatively different than what happens after that. Everything that's needed for the generation of life is contained in these two essences. And that's the first kind of whole meaning or definition that we should have when we think about what does it mean, essence. That which is necessary for the regeneration of life. Now, from that moment on, the processes that are engendered by the fusion of the essence of the male and the essence of the female are involved with incorporating ingredients that are obtained from the outer world and transforming them into this meat puppet that we carry around with us. And operate oh so skillfully or skilllessly for the rest of our natural born lives. So you start to see what I mean by this kind of sublime difference between the two things. There's one sense in which essence means that self-contained, self-possessed, irreducible quantity that will regenerate life. How many sperm does it take to make a human being? One. How many eggs? And then there's the other notion of essence, which is the broken down bits of the environment which can be incorporated into the processes that the self is engaged in performing. The whole spectrum of life activities. So you see, they face in two different directions. One faces inward, one faces outward. And that's exactly what's conveyed by the Chinese terms, Xian Tian Huo Tian.
Can you spell Huo Tian?
H-O.
It's interesting how many of these words are the names of herbs too, or partially different parts. Or you see it in the Chinese herbs.
That's because that's what they're addressing.
Yeah, I know, because I work in the clinic, but to me, it still makes it logical. Yeah.
Well, the language that we're discussing is the language of Chinese medicine. I mean, that's why these terms are here. These are not painting terms. They're ice skating terminology. This is the language that we use to describe patients, medicaments, methods. I'll pass this piece of paper around. And I want to talk a little bit about the character. So look at the character for Jing. Any questions so far? Please, don't wait for me to ask for questions. If you've got questions, just blurt them out.
Are any of these this is kind of an obscure question, but on mahjong tiles? Do you see any of these characters on mahjong tiles? Maybe east and west.
Yeah, I was just going to say maybe those directions, but no, I don't think of.
Sorry, that was family lineage to play mahjong, so all of a sudden I was
You play
thinking-
mahjong?
I did. But it's kind of the way I play bridge. I don't really.
I played a lot of mahjong.
Yeah, mahjong. Yeah, mahjong.
So what you see in this character, it's typical of Chinese characters that they have a left and a right side.
Which one?
Jing.
It's like means two symbols put together, right? Two different words.
Well, we should have a day where we just spend on the basics of Chinese language.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would
so-
like that a lot.
So we'll dial that into the schedule. But the left-hand side is what sometimes gets called the radical, or the root, or the signific. It's the phoneme that contains the germ of the meaning of the word. In order to learn to use a Chinese dictionary, you have to learn to identify in characters that are made up of multiple parts which has that status, because that's the way a Chinese dictionary is organized. All the words with one radical in the same section. And the words within a section are put in order of stroke count from fewer to greater. So you have to know how a Chinese character is written. Because when you look at it, you have to be able to figure out how many strokes it is. And that's the alphabet of Chinese dictionaries, the radical and the stroke count. Come the day that we go over this, you'll understand this more. But the radical in Jing is grain or rice, mi. That's that thing on the left-hand side that looks like a cross with the four corners all filled in with a little dot pointing towards the center. That means rice. The the piece on the right-hand side is Qing, and it means lots of things, but in this case it means green.
What?
Green.
Green? Oh.
So this character shows us green rice. If you have any familiarity with or have ever raised rice, which the Chinese have done once or twice, you know implicitly what green rice means. Green rice means the sprout. I have seen the Sichuan rice fields, miles of them from nearby mountains, in the springtime when the rice is sprouted. The glowing green color is amazing. It's the color of springtime. It's the color that says, life has come back. And kind of sociologically, the part of China I was just seeing in my mind's eye is the traditional breadbasket of China. So over the millennia, when life has come back to this part of China, symbolized by the color of green rice, life is back for the whole country. Essence. Qi will leave and talk about Shen. In order to really talk about Shen, I have to spend a little time pointing out a few differences implied by the worldview of the Abrahamic religion world, Judaism and Christianity, and what I described as the no religion world of China. Because spirit is an important term in both sets, in both contexts, yet it means quite different things. And in order to appreciate what the difference is, you have to sort of draw some of the main differences in spiritual identity and spiritual significance, spiritual value. The Abrahamic religions, the monotheistic religions of the Middle East, promulgated a kind of view of the world which Alan Watts described as the ceramic model of the universe. They saw the universe as a created thing. Like the potter makes the pot, God created the world. And so the act of creation, the dynamism of creation, is represented by a straight line, an arrow. It's reflected in a great deal of the thought patterns of the so-called Western world. God is on high. God dispenses creation. The job of the created spirit is to reunite with the Godhead. This is the promise of Christianity. By believing in me, said Jesus, you regain the kingdom of heaven. Speaking of the impact on the notion of morality, the great writer Lin Yutang pointed out that to the Jew or Christian, it is inconceivable for two people to behave in a moral way with one another without each individual accepting the moral authority of a third party. The judge, God the judge. Someone who knows the difference between right and wrong and can objectively assess a situation, and someone who's so powerful that everybody is subservient. The Chinese, on the other hand, found it equally unthinkable that any two people couldn't get together and negotiate a mutually acceptable, mutually agreeable moral code of conduct without any third party being involved. This is the essence of the Chinese gentleman. It's also the basis of what people see in Chinese morals as a fundamental amorality, no morality, situational morality. And the Chinese would probably come down in favor of such ideas of situational morality, noting that there is no universal good. What's good for one on one day is bad for the same one on another day, or bad for a different one on the same day.
Is that why when the Chinese communist state was forming, it was so easy for people to turn in their fathers or mothers, or there was so much killing of the intellectual? I mean, I just was wondering if that is the Abrahamic thought of someone who doesn't understand what you're saying.
You know, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an academic, so I can address the question you raise. Probably if you wanted to trace that behavior to an historic source, what we think of as Neo-Confucianism promulgates a kind of sense of total authority to the hierarchy of society. That your potency as an individual derives utterly from your place in the social order. And that your survival is pegged to and completely dependent upon your proper performance of the rights and duties of your position. Not to question. If someone up the ladder says shit, you say how much. If they say jump, you say how high. Fertig.
Dankeschön.
Bitte.
It makes me think these two sort of like approaches to morality, it applies so much to me to medicine, the way that it's done here, where it's like there's right way, science is, or like it's there is a right way, there's one right way. Any patient that comes in with this is what you give them, versus the Chinese way that's like every single time you see that patient, they're a different person, and every time you see the same symptom, it could be a different, like, there's no, like, third party saying this is what's happening. It's like two people figuring it out at that time.
Well, one of the ways in which modern medicine validates itself is by promoting a linkage to science. And what is meant by science is largely statistics. The reason for that kind of behavior that you just mentioned is that someone can point to a study somewhere that shows 75% of patients respond in a positive way to whatever the subject.
What about the other 25%?
Yeah, exactly so. Cost of doing business. You don't accept?
I accept. Well, I see.
Anyway, what I was trying to do is just kind of draw some relief to the notion of the difference in spiritual values. When we talk about a spirit in the West, a spirit in the West is what? A spirit is a unit of identity which accepts as one of its prime driving forces the urge for reunification with the Godhead. There's a great lyric from a Joni Mitchell song that says, Guru books, the Bible, only a reminder that either you're or we're just not good enough. A spirit in Abrahamic religion is a unit of inadequacy, which can only be made adequate through observation and performance of proper religious belief and practice. A spirit in the Chinese context, on the other side, or the other hand, is a unit of vitality. When we talk about seeing someone's spirit, we're talking about observing the outward manifestation of the internal vitality. Now the word is interesting. The word is composed on the left-hand side of a character that's pronounced sh, which is an ancient ideogram of starlight falling on Earth.
How do you spell that word?
The pinyin is S-H-I. The word means manifestation, but its verbal roots refer to manifestation of celestial information on Earth. On the right-hand side is one of the earthly branches from an ancient system of counting called heavenly stems and earthly branches, which also is a subject of such complication and importance that we should spend a day or a year talking about it. But this system of heavenly stems and earthly branches was used, among other things, for keeping track of time. And so Shen turns out to be a time of day. And it was a time of day in the ancient Zhou imperial court when the emperor got together with his astrologers, with his shaman, to interpret celestial signs. So hidden in the components of the word Shen is some inkling of the manifestation of celestial influences. And for celestial, we might substitute the notion of mysterious or unknown. The only people who could make any sense out of certain signs in the sky were magicians. This wasn't common human knowledge. That's why during this time of day the emperor set aside time for reading the signs, for venturing into the unknown. Because one of the jobs most important of the emperor is the care of the people. Well, if you care for the people, you got to know what lies ahead. You know, modern neuroscience research comes up with the understanding that much of what is going on in our brain and nervous system is prediction. Humans are hardwired to guess what's about to happen. Much of our perception of the world is based not on what's out there, but on what we guess is out there. As I think it was Aeneas Nin said, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And we see the world that we expect to see. So this Chinese concept of spirit involves the unknown. Whereas the Abrahamic notion of spirit replaces the unknown with God. God knows everything. He knows if you've been sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good.
And now we bring in Santa Claus.
Same difference. So you appreciate the difference between our Western spirit and the Chinese notion of spirit. I can feel people's bladders filling up. No, I'm not projecting at all. I'm just imagining that we should. Yeah, we'll take 10. 10 to 1.